Ethan should have been asleep hours ago. He wasn't sure if it was the reoccurring nightmares or the vortex of the deep web that kept him from sleeping. Either way, he was going to have a rough day at the office after this. He'd just come back, too. A death in the family was one thing, but when he found his brother next door, drawn up and swinging from a rope off the staircase, that qualified Ethan for a few weeks off. Some time went by, but sleep didn't really seem to take any natural form. Just the raw replay of the swinging body. After his sister left last week, and the phone calls slowed down, he was alone. The monotony of his job and the sleepless nights turned into a numb vortex. He was searching for something. He didn't know what, but he felt like there was something out there that could break this bleak cycle of sleep-deprived apathy. He knew there were places he shouldn't tread on the deep web, and he steered clear of anything that looked weird or off-putting. There weren't any ads either. It made sense. What company would want to get caught advertising on the dark underbelly of the internet? Still, Ethan thought it felt weird to not be perpetually inundated with unclosable ad windows. Weird, but refreshing. This night was just like the others, only instead of waiting for the nightmares, sweaty and clutching the sheets, he decided to skip right to his search. His glassy, bloodshot eyes ran over pages of information. He'd stumbled onto a page about dreams and the powers of lucid dreaming. There were a bunch of documents there, mostly blacked out, that claimed to be taken from the Pentagon. Dream experiments. Not much could be deciphered through the long black rectangles that littered the pages. Ethan decided to go back to the home screen to look for files that seemed to have a bit more unearthed information. Before he clicked back, he had to take a trip to the bathroom. The kitchen tile was cold on his feet. It was that time of year where the days were relatively warm, but the nights got colder than he liked. He left the door open. He usually did. Well, not recently because of his sister's stay, but now that she was gone, he was back to his old ways. Ethan didn't really bother turning too many lights on anymore either. He knew the layout of his house. He just left one lamp on in the front room and allowed the glow of his computer screen to light his living room, the place he'd been essentially nesting the past few weeks. Over the sound of his stream, he heard a soft ding coming from the living room. This startled him. Was it a message? He thought. The tone wasn't a notification sound he'd recognized from his laptop or phone. He finished and walked back to the living room, again over the cold kitchen tile. The sound was coming from his computer. Another ding rang out. Ethan yawned and sat back on the couch. The room desperately needed a humidifier. You could hear the sound of his dry elbows on the fabric of the couch as he sat. His sister had tried to put things in order and put him in order during her stay, but he remained a bit of a mess, along with his house. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, focusing them on the screen. There was a pop-up chat window. 2 messages hung in the white box. You're still awake. Did you find any answers yet? Ethan raised an eyebrow and skeptically said aloud, Uh-huh. This is a scam, he thought. I'll just click the back button and this window should disappear. He did, and it didn't. His brow furrowed with confusion. Ethan tapped the back button a few more times, but the message box didn't go anywhere. This was starting to freak him out a bit. There was no minimize button on the box. He couldn't close it. Even after fully exiting his deep web browser, the box remained on his screen. He began to look around his dark living room frantically. Something changed in him after seeing his brother's dead body hanging from that staircase. He'd felt a general sense of unease. They ruled it a suicide, but Ethan held on to his doubts. His brother never seemed like the suicide type. Even in dark times, he held things together better than even Ethan had. He was sure that once the police returned his brother's phone, he'd have a few more answers. There was another ding from his computer. We didn't kill your brother. We want to help you. Ethan's sleepy eyes widened at this. What the fuck? He whispered aloud. The other 2 messages were vague enough to be for anyone sifting through the deep web, but this one was too specific for Ethan's comfort. Anger washed over him. He clicked inside the message box and typed, Is this funny to you? Some kind of game? Who the fuck are you, and how did you know my brother? On the other side of the text box were 3 bouncing dots. They were typing. "We didn't know your brother, only that he passed away." Ethan typed back, "And how do you know that?" The 3 dots bounced again. "Your search history. We know what happened. We know you're having dreams." The dots bounced. "There aren't really answers. You can look as deep as you want, but there really aren't. The dreams will fade very slowly, but we can help speed that up a bit if you'd like." Ethan had another sudden flash of anger. He typed, "Stay the hell out of my business and off my computer." He disabled his Wi-Fi and slammed his laptop closed. The next day at work was grueling. Like before, his night was mostly sleepless. Staring into his work computer screen, he thought, "How long can I maintain like this?" His coworker popped over the top of the cubicle. "Eth," he said with an enthusiasm that startled Ethan. "You coming out with us after work? Me and a couple of the other guys are going to go down and check out the new—" He stopped as his eyes met Ethan's. "You aren't looking so good, brother." He looked left to right and then circled around the entrance of Ethan's cubicle, speaking in a tone meant just for Ethan's ears. He asked, "You all right, man? You ever have any trouble with that browser that you showed me?" Ethan asked. His coworker took a quick glance behind him and leaned in even closer. "There's some weird stuff in there, man. I don't dig into that, but so far the FBI hasn't come crashing through my window or anything. You get a virus or something?" "Not exactly," Ethan said. "I was on there last night and I got this pop-up window with a message box that I couldn't close. I even exited my browser and everything. It just stayed up on my screen." "That's weird, man. You sure you weren't dreaming that? You keep telling me that sleep ain't exactly your strong suit lately. Maybe you should come out with us tonight and try to get your head straight." Ethan thought about it for a moment. Going out somewhere sounded awful to him. He was tired and really did want to try and rest. "Nah, I'm going to take a rain check and try to actually get some sleep tonight." He knew that was a lie. That he'd lie there in his bed, catching only pockets of broken sleep between the reoccurring nightmares. There was a liquor store down the road from his work, and Ethan decided to leave early to fetch himself a nightcap. He wasn't really a drinker, but knew that when he used to drink, it would usually put him out. Now that his sister was gone, he could experiment without worrying her. One of his other friends had given him some weed gummies, swearing that they'd do the trick, but he was afraid they'd make him feel even more paranoid than he already felt. Best not to fall deeper down that rabbit hole. It was Friday night, so Ethan wasn't too worried about having a hangover. Hangovers in his 30s weren't as easy as they were in his 20s, but he'd settle for one if it got him some sleep. After a few mixed drinks and a few hours of listening to old records, he found himself face to face with his laptop again. The buzz wasn't too much for him to navigate to his deep web browser. He clicked it open and took another sip from his drink. There were a few pages he'd like to frequent. Some of them had to do with leaked government experiments. Half of them seemed fake, but he'd gotten pretty good at sifting until he found a real one. It might have been the fact that he wasn't sleeping, or the fact that wanting to sleep was on his mind a lot. Either way, he found himself searching for experiments that had to do with sleep more frequently. A hyperlink took him to another page. The title at the top read, "An Analysis of Sleep While in States of Hypertrauma." He took another drink and emptied his glass. It was time for a refill. The record player was on the last song of the LP in the other room, and he'd need to flip it soon. Kind of Blue was his favorite Miles Davis record, and he pretty much knew it by heart. After some fresh ice cubes and a few splashes of juice from the refrigerator, he felt the bathroom calling him. He could hear the last piano and cymbal hit as he tickled the air with his free hand, emulating the pianist. The record player was now sending a dull click through the air. This was a small pet peeve of his. He didn't like to let the player ride longer than the record, but he had to finish up first. Closing his eyes, he swayed back and forth just a bit. Maybe the drinks were working, he thought. From the living room, the sound of the ding rang out, the one from the night before. His eyes shot open and out of the bathroom doorway into the living room. He stumbled slightly on his way to the record player and then clicked it off. Then he moved to the couch and sat down. The text box was there again, gleaming at him. In his reply box was a flashing cursor waiting for his response, and above that, there was a message. "We can still help you, Ethan." He didn't feel the surge of anger he had before. In its place was a strange curiosity. The drinks had loosened him up a bit, and he wondered who they were and what exactly they wanted. Without trying to sound too eager or interested, he typed, "I'm listening." The 3 dots bounced again. "We already know you've lost someone. You've been searching for ways to stop your nightmares. We can take those nightmares from you, and you won't have to fight them anymore." "What do you mean?" he typed back. "We specialize in dreams. It's our business. Instead of falling asleep holding on to that scene in your head, you can replace it with something new. You can rest easy and sleep again." Ethan took another sip and stared at the message for a moment. He typed, "How would that even work? This definitely feels like some kind of scam. I guess next you'll need my social security number and bank information?" The dots bounced. "We'd have no trouble getting that, with or without your cooperation. But that isn't what interests us. There is no fee, no tricks, no payment plan. You just have to be willing to give up the dreams." Ethan was feeling in rare form. Usually, he wouldn't entertain something like this, but a bit of a buzz and a tickling curiosity had him wanting to see how far he could take the conversation. "How would we do this? I just put my eyes up to the screen and you suck the nightmare out of my head? This doesn't even make sense." He waited a moment for the reply. "It's simple. We'll mail you a device. Just follow the instructions we give you, and you'll be sleeping better in no time." Ethan paused. The answer surprised him. He thought that this was for sure some kind of scam, just looking for even more personal information. "Fine. If you already know where I live and so much about me, put your thing in the mail and let's see what happens." He took a gulp from his drink as the dots bounced. "Then you agree to relinquish your dreams?" "Yeah, sure," he typed back. Suddenly the window closed. Ethan found himself staring at the web page on the sleep experiment. His glass was almost empty. The hangover the next morning wasn't that bad. He had definitely had worse. Nothing some water and maybe some greasy breakfast food couldn't fix. Luckily, his sister had left some food in the fridge before she left. There were enough eggs for an omelet and a quarter bag of wilting spinach. He threw some frozen potatoes in the air fryer before cracking some of his eggs into a cup. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text from his sister, Sarah. "You doing okay, Eth?" He wiped his hands off on a nearby washcloth. Food gunk on his screen was another pet peeve of his. "I'm okay. Seriously, thanks for everything you've done for me. My mind was gone, and you swept in to hold things together. How are you holding up?" Ethan poured his eggs into the warm skillet. Sarah messaged back. "Back to work. Yippee!" "Honestly, though, I've been trying to keep my mind busy. If I sit and think about things too long, I start to go to dark places. For real, though, no problem at all. Being there helped me not be alone. So, at the end of the day, we were really leaning on each other. If you need anything, to talk, to vent, just call me. Love you." Ethan sprinkled some spinach over his eggs. "Love you too, sis." The screen from his laptop was closed, and it was sitting on the small table by the couch where he'd left it before stumbling up to bed. He didn't bother moving it, just sat his plate on top and ate his breakfast. The doorbell rang out. Ding dong. Ethan kept eating. The only people that bothered to ring the doorbell were people trying to sell something. No one just popped in without sending at least a text anymore, at least not in the past 20 years. Ding dong. It rang out again. Ethan rolled his eyes and dropped his fork. He wasn't really in the mood to tell someone he wasn't interested. Nursing his small hangover was already more energy than he wanted to put forth on a Saturday. Ding dong, it rang out again. "I'm coming," he yelled out. "Damn," under his breath. Ethan flung the door open, but no one was there. On his doorstep sat a small box. He looked around his yard and down his street as he bent down to pick it up. There were no markings on it, no address, no return address, just a black, smooth box. He took it inside, sat it on the living room table, and just stared at it. His eyes were locked on the box as he finished his breakfast. There was no doubt who it was from, but he didn't actually think they would send anything. The speed at which it came was also unsettling. Under his plate, His laptop made the notification sound he was starting to become familiar with. It was them. He jammed the last forkful of potatoes in his mouth, and he lifted his laptop screen. The message box was open. "Happy to see the packages arrived." Ethan sat his plate down and responded, "That was fast. What do I do now?" The dots bounced. "We'll walk you through everything. First, open the box." He patted his face with a napkin and lifted his box from the coffee table onto his small laptop table. There was a flap. He undid it and slid out a smooth, black, rectangular object about the size of a book. The only marking it had was a circle on the top, near the front. Ethan looked back to the text box and read, "Touch the circle." He looked back at the object and slowly reached his hand out. As his finger made contact with the circle, a ring of white light pulsed around it. There was a faint, mechanical whizzing sound that came from within. Suddenly, 2 arms popped out from the top and extended above the object. They were like small, adjustable lamp arms, but with no springs or hinges, just smooth, black metal. At their ends were circular sockets. They had the shape of eyewash station spray heads, but instead of having spray heads, they had open, empty holes. Ethan looked back at his computer. There was a new message. "Place your eyes over the holes. Look into them." Hell no, he thought. The message box flashed again. "You've got nothing to worry about, Ethan. All we do is show you something new and take the nightmares from you." Details from the memory of his hanging brother flashed in his mind, vivid and raw. The rope tied off on the banister, his purple, bloated face, the eyes that should have been closed, but were open, staring into his. He took a deep breath and leaned forward towards the object slowly. His eyes were getting closer to the openings at the ends of the arms. There was a soft, white light inside, very faint. He could hear something inside, too. A very quiet, whooshing sound, almost like waves or long breaths. His eyes met with the openings, and his peripheries went dark. The soft white light pulsed for a moment. It was calming. Ethan's accelerated breath and heartbeat slowed now. He felt relaxed. Then the white light got brighter and dissipated, as if he were awakening from a dream. He was on a green hillside with trees sprinkled about. The sun was shining bright, and there were white puffy clouds floating in the blue sky. It was warm, and he looked down to see that he was now wearing white, gleaming pajamas. Breathing in, he could smell the freshness of the trees and the grass. Mixed with the breeze and the chirping birds, he could hear a soft, creaking sound. Ethan didn't know where it was coming from, and began to look around. As he turned behind, set between 2 tall oak trees, he saw the vision from his nightmares. Amongst the beauty of his surroundings, there it was, cut like a chunk of meat from his brain, sitting in the grass. The towering wall, the staircase and banisters, his hanging brother, the scene he wanted to forget. It looked so surreal and strange to see it surrounded by such beauty. A gust of wind blew by and tousled his pajamas. Walking barefoot across the grass, he approached the scene. He stepped up and onto the tiles of his brother's front room floor. The eyes were open, staring, like they always were. Ethan walked across the tiles, staring back into them. He became lost in them. Slowly, like ink dropping into water, they turned completely black. They felt closer now, massive and glaring. He kept moving forward, staring at those glassy black spheres. They consumed his entire field of vision, and as he had been surrounded by a pure white light before, he was now surrounded in darkness. No more trees, grass, wind, or birds, just darkness. It sounded now like he was underwater. All around him were deep, bassy sloshing tones. He reached out and found that he was in fact submerged. Ethan's limbs were moving back and forth, and he was bobbing in the darkness. There didn't seem to be an up or down. He was weightless and felt no sense of direction. Oddly, He didn't feel like he was holding his breath or in need of oxygen at all. He pushed through the liquid, swimming, reaching out as he did so in an effort to avoid colliding with anything unseen. His sense of touch was currently the only one he could rely on. Then, from far off, he saw a faint light. It was barely there, but could be seen clearly in the dark waters. He swam to it. It was impossible to tell, but he felt like he was swimming up. The closer he got, the brighter it became. It looked like a natural light, piercing through the top of the water. Rays of light were beginning to show from the top, and he could see more of the surrounding water's surface as well. With one final kick, he broke through the surface of the water. Opening his eyes, he saw that he was in a small pond that sat at the bottom of encircling valleys. Grass and trees, like the ones from before, were all around him. The same blue sky with fluffy clouds was overhead. He bobbed in the warm breeze. Things felt calm again. Then, faintly, he heard singing. A female voice, soft and delicate. She wasn't singing any particular words, but rather tones that slid in pitch and had a slight vibrato to them. Ethan turned in the pool, and then he saw her. She was standing on a large rock along the edge of the pond. Many smaller rocks were all around her. Her hair was long and black, and it swirled around her body in an angelic way. It seemed to catch the breeze, but it also flowed with an effort of its own. She wore long, white, vibrant fabrics that seemed to do the same. Although they weren't looking at him, Ethan could see that she had dazzling blue eyes, almost white. He swam to her, and as he did so, her eyes met his. They were calling to him as she sang. Her voice was filling the space between them. It filled his head, and he buzzed with an attraction like a moth to a light. All at once, she stopped singing, and he stopped swimming towards her. She closed her eyes and lifted her hands to the sky gracefully. Then, her form quickly dissipated into a fog. Ethan was alone now, floating silently in the water, looking at the dissipating fog swirl away in the breeze. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them, he saw nothing but black again. A ding rang out from his computer, and he pulled his head away from the object on the table. The two arms retracted back into the box, creating a smooth black surface again. The top of his head and his face were tingling. It wasn't painful, but felt similar to when a limb falls asleep. There was a new message on his computer. In place of your nightmare will be her. Ethan was still reeling with excitement from what he'd just experienced as he typed his response. What just happened? What did I just go through? The dots bounced. We took the nightmare from you. She'll be in its place. When we take something, we always put something in its place. Ethan thought for a moment, and then typed his reply. Why would you want to take something like that? What are you going to do with it? The dots bounced. You'd be surprised at the things our clients request. Ethan's face changed from curiosity to disgust. The text box sent one last message. Sleep well, and then disappeared from his screen. For the rest of the day, Ethan replayed what he'd seen in his mind. The black box remained on the table. Every once in a while he'd peek over at it, half hoping to see the arms and eye holes extended again. If they had been, he wasn't sure he would experiment with going back into that world without being told to do so. He kept thinking about their message. We took the nightmare from you. She'll be in its place. It floated on the forefront of his mind as he went throughout his day, which consisted of fairly low-effort activities. A short walk, diving back into his records, and a few texts back and forth with his sister, Sarah. He couldn't have paid much attention to anything, even if he'd wanted to. The anticipation of sleep pulled at him. Excitement for sleep wasn't something he'd felt in some time, and he reeled at the idea of decent rest. In the back of his mind, there was doubt, even fear, but it seemed to be overwritten by the excitement. Evening finally came, and Ethan sent one last text before brushing his teeth. I'm going to try to get some rest, sis. Hope you can do the same. Love you. As he laid in his bed, he felt comfortable. The anxiety that had loomed over him before sleep seemed to have evaporated, just like the woman from the vision in the black box. That woman, Ethan thought. She filled his thoughts as he drifted off into a peaceful sleep. He found himself again in the small pond surrounded by hills of green grass and luscious trees. He'd thought that place was some kind of loading screen for the box to materialize and take dreams. Maybe it embedded this place into my mind, he thought. The sound of singing was nearby. This time, however, it was a ways off, unseen. Ethan swam to the edge of the pond and climbed onto a rock. As he did, he realized that he was somehow completely dry. His white pajamas gleamed in the sunlight. The soft voice swirled around him and seemed to coalesce with the air that pushed against his body. It guided him from the rock and to a nearby tree. The woman's singing was louder here, but he still couldn't see her. He walked past the tree and into a clearing of tall grass that sat encircled amongst many more trees. The singing grew louder still. His bare feet felt warm against the mossy earth beneath. Then he saw her. She was lying in the grass. Her black hair and white clothing were sprawled around her, and her hands swirled in the air like the delicate breeze as she sang. Ethan pushed the grass and taller plants aside as he approached her. Her voice glided up and down, seamlessly shifting to different notes and octaves. Ethan laid next to her on the ground. Her hands fell softly from the air as she turned to embrace him. She was warm, and he felt safe. Still singing, she took her hand and placed it behind Ethan's head. She pushed it to her chest. The side of his face and his ear now rested upon her. He could feel a hum pulse through her entire body as she sang. Ethan moved closer, and her embrace became full. Their bodies were now close and intertwined. She continued to sing, and Ethan allowed the frequencies of her voice to envelop his entire body. Her scent was that of spring, of fresh earth and rain. He closed his eyes, and he saw only white. He was truly at peace, and slept deeper than he had his entire life. Sunbeams pierced the edges of his drawn curtains as he awoke. Birds were chirping outside. Ethan took a deep breath and smiled. It worked, he thought. Relief washed over him. He made it through the night without the nightmares. The dream in its place was still very vivid to him. It felt real. That earthly smell still seemed to linger in his bedroom. The day moved slowly. Ethan moved with confidence, and intrusive thoughts about his brother's suicide felt like distant memories. The loss he felt was still there, but the grueling images felt like a mirage, one he was happy to let fade from his thoughts. Again, he was excited for sleep, and he set out for it earlier than usual. He brushed his teeth and dimmed the lights. It was early evening, but Ethan couldn't wait. Besides, he thought, I might as well rest up for the work week ahead. There's no shame in getting too much sleep. He drifted. The familiar breeze and the bird chirps returned. Only this time he wasn't in the pond. When he opened his eyes, it felt familiar. It was the clearing he'd been in before, the grassy hill, the vision he'd received from the black box. Fear washed over him. He was frozen in the grass. This is where they'd shown him the vision of his brother with the cold black eyes. Ethan closed his eyes and whispered, "No." Then he heard singing, the delicate singing from his savior. His eyes shot open and he turned quickly. She was there, in the grass, amongst the sun and the trees. Ethan exhaled, and his fear dissipated. He began to walk towards her. The angelic voice again beckoned him. As he moved slowly across the grass, their eyes met. Their vibrance was hypnotic and peaceful to him. Suddenly, she rang out a note that startled him. It was a deep, pulsing note that didn't hold the elegance her previous notes had. She held it as Ethan continued to move, his eyes still transfixed. Just then, the ground began to tremble. The earth beneath the woman began to rise to a platform. Stairs ripped from the ground around her, coated in moss and dirt. Ethan stopped. The tone she sang became louder, and the light fluffy clouds above grew dark and menacing. The sky seemed to close in around them, as the breeze became intense. Tree limbs were now swinging violently, creaking. Once the swirling stairs reached their full height, a thick, thorned vine grew downward from the top towards the woman. Her eyes, still fixed on Ethan's, changed. Like his brothers, they turned black, like ink drops into water. The vine wrapped itself around her neck and pulled her into the air. No longer was her tone solid. It now shifted quickly, going from shrill highs to deep guttural lows. Ethan stood, shocked. The scene of his brother's suicide was again unfolding in front of him, only now in this new, twisted way. Her hands were now cutting through the air, matching the spontaneous shifting of her voice. She started to cough blood onto the platform below. Her soft black hair became a wiry tangle of knots and decay. The ringing of her voice was broken by coughs and blood, but she continued. He moved forward and onto the platform. His feet touched the warm blood as he looked up at her dark eyes. Her voice coated his mind, and he again felt the fear and pain he'd thought he'd lost. The blood poured from her, like a waterfall now, coating his white pajamas and the platform below them. Her dark eyes, still fixed on his, now swirled with gray to match that of the clouds in the sky above. Slowly, amongst the screaming and the blood, Ethan's vision was filled with the gray and black swirls. He was lost in it, and soon it became all that he saw or felt. A lost swirl of madness and hopelessness. The sheets were coated in sweat when he screamed out. His room was dark. It was very early in the morning now. Hopes for another peaceful night's sleep were ripped from him, and now a fountain of grotesque images flowed from their place. Ethan was hyperventilating. He needed water. After chugging the glass of water that sat on the nightstand, he managed to make his way downstairs to the bathroom, where he splashed cold water onto his face. The white noise from the faucet calmed him. He seemed to wash out her voice as it still rang in his head. From the living room, he heard the ding. He ran to his computer and pulled the screen open. The message box stared back at him. "We can make it go away, Ethan. Just open the box." He let out a quick breath of anger. "Who the fuck do you think you are? This wasn't part of the deal. I was supposed to sleep now, not get whatever the hell that was." The dots bounced. "We're so sorry. This is new emerging technology, and sometimes there are unforeseen glitches that occur. If you'd be able to exchange with the box again, we'd be more than happy to remedy this." "Exchange with the box? Why, so you can sell another nightmare to your clients?" "Rest assured, this wasn't part of our plan. Our team is dedicated to making this right. It won't happen again." Ethan sat, thinking for a moment. He was tired and frustrated. The sweet sound of the woman's original soothing voice filled his head. The dots bounced. "Just open the box, Ethan." He looked over at the box sitting on the coffee table. It felt cold when he picked it up and sat it next to his laptop. The message box was gone now. Only the dim light of his computer remained. He placed his finger on the circle, and the ring lit up as it did before. Again, Ethan broke the surface of the small pond and swam to its edge. The sweet singing was in the air, and like before, it called him to it. He found her in the tall grass once more. Lying down, she pulled him close, and the warm hum of her chest soothed his mind. Her hair fell upon his face, soft and fragrant with earth. As they laid there, her tones suddenly shifted. The angelic cascading notes moved to the low bellow they had before. His eyes opened, and he felt her squeeze him closer. Her black hair was now wrapping around him, pulling him closer still. Again, her voice began to shift like it had before when she swung from the staircase. Ethan struggled to pull himself from her, but her grip tightened. Her voice bellowed and screamed out, muffled by the blood pouring from her mouth. He felt it spewing over his head and body as her hair and arms pushed him deeper into her. The radiant warmth of her was now replaced with only the warmth of her blood. The smell of decay flooded into his nose, and he almost vomited. Everything was dark now. Ethan felt as though he'd been pulled into her form, wrapped into her being. It felt like death. He had no choice but to surrender to its pull and become one with it. He awoke screaming in his bed. The sheets were again covered in sweat. The alarm going off from his phone felt like the screech of a hawk scraping against his brain. His heart rate and breathing slowed slightly as he realized it was only a dream. There was no time to think about what had just happened or how he got to his bed. He was late for work. The fluorescent lighting made Ethan feel more nauseous than he already was. He could have called off work, no problem. No one would have had a second thought about it, considering the circumstances. But he needed to get out of the house. It felt dirty and tainted by his new dreams and visions. He slipped into his cubicle and decided that getting lost in his work might help him forget about what he'd just gone through. It was all a dream anyway. Wasn't it? He thought. His boss was cutting him tons of slack because of his brother's death, so there were countless projects piling up. He picked one and decided to get to work. "Eth!" a voice called from above, sitting at the edge of the cubicle. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The enthusiasm from that one tone added to his nausea and frustration. His computer monitor might as well have been a series of glyphs in ancient foreign languages to him. His brain felt broken. "Man, we had a blast last week. When are you going to make a point to come out with us? I think Cheryl has a thing for you, and she's usually there. It'll be good for you, man." Ethan's frustration boiled. He knew it was unwarranted, but he couldn't help himself from grinding his teeth. He kept typing and staring into his screen, not really knowing if he was actually doing anything that made sense at all. Just camouflage. "You can even pick the next spot, man. We don't have to go—" "Hey, Eth, you still with me, buddy?" His coworker snapped his fingers a few times. Those snaps echoed through Ethan's head like gunshots ricocheting down a steel tunnel. His frustration hit a tipping point, and he was forced to pull his eyes from his screen. His eyes widened as he looked up. It was her, the woman from his dreams, not the warm, angelic version of her, but the wretched, twisted one. Blood poured from her mouth, and her black eyes stared into his. "This isn't real. They're fucking with my head," he thought. "Hey, Eth, you don't look so good," the woman said with the voice of Ethan's coworker, more blood falling from her mouth as she did so. In his shock, Ethan managed to pull a few words from his mouth. "I'm sick. I'm gonna call it a day." As fast as he could, he picked up his suitcase, grabbed his keys, and left the office with a pace that was just shy of running. He slammed his hands against his steering wheel as he drove, crying out, "No, no, no, no!" The sky was dark overhead. Clouds swirled like they had in his visions. Ethan thought out loud, "I'm not losing it. I gotta get a hold of them. They gotta fix this. They said it's just a glitch. It's a glitch and they can fix it." He knew he was trying to convince himself out loud that the people on his computer couldn't fix everything, and for whatever reason probably wanted things to get worse. Who were their clients, he thought? Why were they interested in nightmares, and why did these people want his or anyone's for that matter? He pulled into the driveway just as it started to sprinkle. Looking down at his phone, he realized his sister Sarah had been texting him. She sent 1 or 2 last night, and then a few recently. It was really unlike Ethan to not respond to her, and her last message read, "Ethan, you all right?" There was some motion in his rearview mirror, and Ethan looked up to see a cop car pull into his driveway behind him. Thoughts raced through his mind. Were they here because I've been on the deep web? Because I've been talking to the dream people? He thought. The cop got out of his car carrying a medium-sized clear plastic bin. Ethan was still rattled from his encounter at the office. He wasn't sure if he wanted to watch this cop turn into some kind of creature or version of the dream woman. Frozen in his car, staring forward, the cop tapped on the window. Ethan clicked his keys clockwise in the ignition and rolled down the window. "Ethan, right? I remember you from a few weeks ago." "Yeah, that's me," Ethan managed to say. "Look, we're real sorry about your brother. These are some of his personal items that we had to take for the investigation. His phone, wallet, computer. We thought there was some kind of hard drive at the scene too. Turns out it was just some weird chunk of metal. It's in here too." Ethan rolled up his window and they walked to the porch. It was raining now. The officer sat the bin down and looked at Ethan. He could see the weariness in his eyes and the pain. "It don't get easier, but eventually you'll start sleeping again." They shook hands, the officer nodded, walked back to his cruiser, and drove off. Ethan breathed with relief. No twisted vision or pouring blood. He picked up the bin and went inside. Everything was in there: wallet, keys, computer, other small things. It felt weird to Ethan to have these things in his house. His brother was gone, and he didn't know what he was going to do with any of it. He felt distracted. He needed to find a way to get in touch with the dream people so he could end all of this. Then he noticed something he hadn't before in the bin. It was underneath his brother's laptop, a box. Ethan took the laptop out and sat it on the couch next to him. Then he pulled out the box. He flipped the flap open and slid a smooth black object into his lap. It was another dream box. Ethan picked it up and stared at it, shocked. A tsunami of thoughts tore through his mind. He felt overloaded with emotions. Fear, paranoia, anger, and confusion washed over him. Then he heard a ding ring out from his laptop. He flipped it open to see the now familiar message box. "There are a few ways we could go from here, Ethan. You're not without options." Ethan's spinning wheel of emotions landed on anger. "Who the fuck are you? Why did my brother have a box? I'm tired of playing this stupid game. Tell me how to fix this and stay the hell out of my life." The dots bounced. "Calm down, Ethan. Your brother wasn't able to hold the box long enough for a full extraction. Our client needed that experience, and we weren't able to deliver. If you agree to our terms, we can end this." Ethan was fuming. "What the hell do you mean by couldn't hold the box long enough? He was holding it when he died?" The dots bounced. "Correct." Ethan screamed out in anger and threw his laptop against the wall. He felt like he was losing control. As he ascended his staircase, it began to take the shape of the earth-like staircase the woman in his vision had hung from. The stairs were covered in wet moss, and tendrils of thorny vines ran up the handrail. Ethan could hear the angelic voice of the woman echoing through his house. He managed to reach the top and ran to his room, slamming the door behind him before the vision took full control of his mind. Ding! His phone rang out with the same notification sound his laptop had when they tried to reach him. Ethan's back was against his door as he pulled his phone from his pocket. The entire face of his phone was the message box from his computer. "Your options are as follows. 1. You agree to fulfill the order that your brother could not. 2. We have your sister fulfill the order." Ethan began to type, filled with both rage and fear. "Don't you touch my sister. I'll get the police involved and then—" The dots bounced as he typed, and another message appeared before he could finish typing his. "We are capable of wiping all of your devices. The police will never see any of our conversations, and you will remain under our control." Just then, the woman from Ethan's dreams formed from a cloud in front of him. She was in her former state of beauty and elegance, singing with hands flowing through the air. He stared at her, lost in her gaze. Her voice rose to a shrill, piercing tone, and the window behind her shattered. Swirling wind filled the room, and from it crawled countless black centipedes. They moved with an unnatural quickness up the walls to the ceiling and along the floor. The woman was soon covered in them. They crawled up her white clothes and into her black hair, seeming to become it. Her face was covered in them, all except her bright blue eyes, glowing from behind her mask of squirming arthropods. Her voice cracked and popped from a shrill high tone to a low, gurgling one. Blood poured from her mouth again, and she moved quickly to Ethan. He pressed himself to the door and closed his eyes. Her voice got louder and louder as she approached, and he could start to feel the tiny legs of the centipedes crawling over his feet and up his legs. The wind was swirling violently now, and her voice was deafening. Ding! His phone rang out in his hand. There was no more sound except the rain on his window. He heard himself breathing quickly and trembling. When he opened his eyes, his room was back to normal. The message on the phone read, "You have the choice to remain under our control or not. We can show you an endless nightmare of these visions. You can fulfill the order, or your sister can. You have options." Ethan knew they were right. He knew he didn't have control of the situation. He typed back, "I'll fulfill the order, just leave Sarah alone. What do I have to do?" The dots bounced. "Our client is not pleased with the time it's taken us to deliver. The original terms of our agreement have changed. They are as follows: death by automobile accident, suicide." Ethan stared at his phone and let out a deep breath. He figured asking any real questions was pointless. He typed, "You must be making a lot of money for this." The dots bounced. "This isn't about money, Ethan. This is about pain and fear." "What if I'm not afraid anymore?" He typed back. "You fear for your sister's safety, and you fear death. That should suffice. As you go over the edge, place the device near your eyes to ensure a proper extraction. If proper extraction does not engage, your order will not be fulfilled." One last message appeared in the text box. "Go here, immediately." Ethan's phone changed suddenly to GPS navigation. A path was set for him to complete his order. He opened his door and walked down the stairs. His brother's things were still sitting on the couch, along with his black box. Ethan walked over and began to put his brother's things back in the bin the cop had dropped off. Quickly, he grabbed a Post-it note and pen from the coffee table and scribbled something on it. He slid his brother's dream box back into its box and into the bin. All of the items were just as they were when he opened it. Ding! From his phone. "Immediately, Ethan." "I'm just tidying up before I go," he replied. He grabbed his dream box on the table and pulled his keys from the hook by the door. He couldn't text Sarah if he wanted to. They had full control of his phone, along with his mind. Going to her wasn't an option. They'd certainly activate his visions as soon as they noticed him deviate from the course. So he drove. He was a node now on the screen, a dot on a map, driving to its final destination. The GPS took him far from town, down through the countryside. The time passed in silence. Ethan thought of his life and his family. He cried a few times when some of the memories rose to the surface. It was the little things that brought out the tears. His mom bringing his lunch to school when he'd forgotten it. That time his stepdad showed him how to put washer fluid in his car. The time he, his sister, and brother all pretended to be ghosts and scared their mom. She wasn't scared, but she played along. He'd been driving for a while now. The road had taken him way out to a nature reserve that he and his family used to camp at when he was a kid. It was beautiful. Rolling green hills, luscious nature, and tall trees. More deep memories unlocked as he sped past on the winding road that led him high into the reserve. The GPS was still guiding him, but he already knew where he was going. When he reached the top of the winding road, there was a clearing. Ethan had arrived at the tallest spot of the reserve, Eagle Point. He'd half expected to see families camping there, as his family used to, but no one was. Just empty fire pits and a few picnic tables. There was a trail that led down the middle of the campsites, and at the end was an overlook platform. It was perched high up on a cliff. From it, you could see far into the stretching wilderness below. Miles of trees sprawled out, and there was a river a ways off that cut through the tall, rolling hills. He looked at his phone. The GPS ran right down the middle of the trail and off the cliff. It dinged as the message box filled the screen again. "You must hold the box to your eyes as you go over. Full extraction must be completed to fulfill the order." Ethan closed his eyes and took a long, deep breath. When he opened them, the message box was gone, and his path on the GPS was flashing red, beckoning him to fulfill his order. He took the dream box from the passenger seat and pressed his finger to the circle. The circle lit up white, and the box whizzed. Like before, the lamp-like arms extended. Light was beaming from the eye holes. Ethan pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The campsites to the left and right of him blurred past. His eyes were on the horizon, beyond the small concrete barrier that sat along the perimeter of the lookout point. The sun would be setting in a few hours. His car hit a hole on the path, and he quickly turned the wheel to restabilize. The light that poured from the box was very bright now. His front wheels clipped the bricks of the lookout platform, and his car lurched and screeched as it smashed through the small concrete barrier. It was small enough to not deploy the airbag. He was in the air now. Everything felt slow. His breath, the wind rushing in from the windows, time itself seemed to crawl. The trees were blotted green speckles beneath him that looked like brushstrokes from an impressionist painting. Ethan took his hand from the wheel. They were now both holding the box. He was falling. Soon he'd be mangled amongst the twisted metal of his car. He took another deep breath and looked at the box. The eye holes were swirling and flickering with light. Looking out his cracked windshield to get one last glance at the beauty of the nature all around him, he felt in total control. Relief washed over him. He threw the black box out the window, and for a moment it floated next to the car in unison. Then they both slammed into the ground below. A few days passed. Sarah didn't think she'd be mad at Ethan, but today she was mad. She thought, he could have reached out. He knew that. I was right here, and he ignored me. He knew he had support. She felt guilty. The phone calls had slowed down now. She was on her porch swing. Her face was cupped in her hands when she heard the sound of tires pulling into her driveway. It was a police car. The officer that had met Ethan at his house stepped out, carrying the bin he'd taken to Ethan just a few days ago. Sarah stood up, looking confused. He stepped onto the porch with the bin. I'm so sorry. This is all real common, actually. Not that that helps you, but you'd be surprised how often they come in pairs like this. Look, there are people out there you can talk to. He sat the bin down and put a hand on her shoulder. You're not alone, okay? Looking down at the bin, he said, We've got some of Ethan's things. Got to do an investigation. Then we'll drop them off to you, too. We gave this bin to Ethan shortly before he passed. It's your other brother's items we had to keep. As far as we can tell, Ethan didn't open it, and we figured we should bring it to you so you could at least have that bit of closure. Sarah, with her weary eyes, looked down to the bin, and then back up to the officer. Thank you. He stood and looked at her for a moment, and then said, Remember, you're not alone, Sarah. Sarah's eyes followed him as he turned and got into his cruiser. He waved as he backed out, and she returned with a short flip of her hand. She stared at the bin for a moment, and then picked it up and went inside. Her mind was glazed with grief, and she cried as she set the container on her wooden dining room table. She trembled slightly as she clicked open the top latches of the bin. When she opened it, it was as it had been for Ethan. Her brother's laptop, phone, wallet, and other items were all there. She took the laptop out and put it on the table. Then she saw the box that held the dream box. She picked it up and undid the flap that held it closed. It slid onto the table with a thunk. When she picked it up, it felt cold. Sarah stared at the ominous black box. What is this? She thought. Her fingers moved along its surface, examining it. As her hand moved along the bottom, a small piece of paper that had been attached fell. It was a post-it note, the one Ethan had written on before he had left his house. Sarah reached out and flipped it over slowly. Ethan's scribbled note read, Don't trust them. Don't look in the box. Ethan. She held the small yellow piece of paper with both hands now, and looked down to the black object on her table. Noticing the small circle on the top, she placed her finger there. A white ring began to illuminate. Hey everybody, my name's Steven. I just want to thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed writing it. Writing is a relatively new thing for me. I'm just getting started, but I'm having a really, really fun time. I feel creatively invigorated. I feel neurons in my brain firing. I feel like this is a really special and intricate piece of the creative web, and I'm happy to be hanging out on this node of it. If you enjoyed today's episode, consider giving Strange Whispers a rating or a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. I also have a Patreon at patreon.com/Strange Whispers. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. And over there, I'll be sharing exclusive stories. I'll be sharing glimpses of what inspires me and how my brain sort of comes up with ideas for stories and plots and characters and things like that. So however you choose to support, I cannot thank you enough. I'll see you all in the next episode with the next story. Until then, keep creating.